Hi, everybody. Welcome to our first Friday program for June. My name is Carol Easterly. I am one of the museum program coordinators here at the Kentucky Historical Society. We're very glad to have you with us today. I think we'll probably have a few more folks kind of join us over the next couple minutes. So I will be admitting them as we're getting started here. Let's see. Just to give you a few reminders about Zoom, although I guess we're all getting used to it by now. Just remember that to keep your microphone on mute throughout the event, just so we don't have background noise interrupt the speaker. You're welcome to keep your camera on if you would like to. We like seeing your smiling faces. Just remember we can all see you. And please use the chat feature throughout the presentation or afterwards to submit questions, comments that you may have. And of course, we just want to make sure everyone treats each other and the speaker and the host with respect throughout the event. I do want to make you aware of a few things happening here at KHS. Summer camp starts next week, which is very exciting. It's actually in person this year. We will have some COVID precautions in place, and it is a full day program. So get your kiddos signed up or spread the word if you know some folks looking for stuff for their kids to do this summer. It's going to be fun. Our library's DNA interest group is going to be meeting later this month virtually on June 26th from 2 to 4 p.m. And if you're into genealogical research and want to learn more about how DNA technology can help you, it's a great program. Check it out. Our library staff can really give you some good guidance there. And of course, we want you to join us for next month's First Friday as well. On Friday, July 2nd, our speaker will be Ben Montgomery, a journalist who will be sharing his new book, which is called A Shot in the Moonlight: How a Freed Slave and a Confederate Soldier Fought for Justice in the Jim Crow South. And I believe that came out earlier this year, or last year. So it looks like a fantastic book. I'm looking forward to that very much. Really cool story. So I'm very pleased to introduce, oh, there's somebody else coming in. Very pleased to introduce to you our speaker for today. We have with us Dr. Alea Henle. She is a native Ohioan, though I understand from reading about her that she's lived all over the United States. And she has a Master of Library Science degree as well as a PhD in American history. And currently she is the director of the Access and Borrow Department for the Miami University of Ohio Library System. And she works to build awareness of the ways that the libraries can support student and faculty access and research, which is just really cool. I don't think I was fully aware of those things when I was in college. So glad you're working on that. All right. I think we'll probably have some more folks continue to join us, but Dr. Henle, please take it away.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to giving this talk. It's going to be different from any of the other ones I've done because at some point we're going to veer off from some of my research to talk specifically about some of the at least one Kentucky Historical Society document. But first of all, I figure it usually doesn't hurt to provide a background to the research that I've been doing. I mean, one of my research historical interests, which certainly this book touches on, is why do we have the materials we have to write history? Because of course our ability to write history is shaped by what we have and what we don't have. In turn, at least for the United States, this means thinking about what kinds of historical cultures there are, what kinds of preservation things there are, which means focusing on historical societies. My interests when I went to get my PhD in history were specifically on early America. And so I focused on the period from 1790 to 1850. I'll grant you stopping at 1850 is a little more unusual. People tend to go all the way to the Civil War. But if I'd gone as much as a decade more, I would have had twice as many historical societies to deal with. And I already had quite enough to do research on. So I stopped at 1750. This is very much a comparative view looking at across the societies to say, okay, and also just many of the people who were involved in the societies were also doing things on their own. What were people doing? What were they preserving? How were they preserving? And how did this make a difference? Now, one of the things we need to do is stop back at 1790, 1791, when the first historical society was founded. There was no National Archives. There wasn't there was a Library of Congress, but they basically did not collect historical materials as such. Part of that was because Congress basically said, no, we're not giving you money for that. I mean, in the early years of the Library of Congress, they're saying, look, there's all these wars going on in Europe. We could buy a ton of materials, and Congress is like, no, all you need is a little stuff for us to read. But we're not talking about Congress today. There were no major research libraries in the United States, certainly not compared. There were some in Europe, none in the United States. There were, even the academic libraries were not necessarily very much involved. In fact, in 1794, one person basically said, I'd rather give materials that I have to the Massachusetts Historical Society than to Yale, where they would probably become food for worms. So, yeah, and the libraries the academic libraries that did exist back then, they weren't that big. Even Harvard, well, Harvard had a fire, so they were the biggest one, but they weren't that big. There were a couple of libraries like the Library Company of Philadelphia, but they weren't really collecting historical materials at all. And there were personal collections. In fact, many of the personal collections, individual people collecting historical materials supported a lot of the early writing of history. But the problem when you've got somebody who has a personal collection is what happens when they die. If you're lucky, if they're lucky, their kids actually share their heirs share their interests. But there's at least one big collection in Virginia where the son was like, I'm going to sell it. So there's concern about those personal connections. And then also there's the issue of governments. Governments at that time were not, and I would say also to a certain extent current times too, were not collecting materials for history. They were collecting things more to make sure that they got paid the taxes that they were due, and to make sure that all the financial materials were in line. The state of Connecticut, or rather than the colony of Connecticut, did actually several times ask its governor and some of its leading citizens to collect materials documenting the early years of the colony. They did that, though, not for history, but because they wanted to make claims to lands further west, where I am and where you guys are, presumably right now. So it wasn't for historical purposes. So basically, at that time, when the first historical society came into existence, nobody else was really doing this very much at all. Materials were going all over the place. Just to give a government example, and this doesn't just happen back then, but we're not getting into politics at all. A lot of people would be writing letters in both their personal capacity and their governmental capacity at the same time. So where does their copy of the letter go? Do they keep it as their own papers? Do they give it to the government when they hand over their papers at the end of their term in government? So it was a big mess, and we've actually spent the last 200 odd years collecting materials just to try and make up for some of that. Now, before we get into this a little deeper, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the historical societies and talk a little bit about who they were and who they weren't. The first historical society in the United States was founded in Massachusetts in 1790, 1791. The second one was in New York. The third one was also in Massachusetts. It was the American Antiquarian Society. And that was basically it until we hit the 1820s, and when a number of states all of a sudden realized, oh, right, we need to start doing this, mostly because they were having either colonial celebrations or colonial centennial celebrations, or they were doing various things to celebrate the Marquis de Lafayette's tour of the United States, or also just to celebrate the Revolutionary War activities and the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So there were a lot, and also, at least in New England, if any of you are familiar with New England, there were a lot of rivalries. And in the 1820s, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Maine all realized, wait a minute, Massachusetts is gathering materials that relate to our history, and they're writing it and they're getting it wrong. So basically, I have also sorts of wonderful lines where Rhode Island and Vermont are really getting into that. So a lot more historical societies started coming up in the 1830s. Also, for instance, Kentucky. in part because there's a lot of New Englanders leaving New England and going elsewhere. And most, not all of the historical societies elsewhere do actually have at least one New Englander who among their founding members. Kentucky, Indiana, Louisiana, Virginia. Virginia was pretty laggard in that, all over the place. And also the American Antiquarian Society contributed to the start of what eventually became the Federal Depository Library Program, wherein Congress decided, after various pleas, to send a copy of, 2 copies of all documents to each state, one of which was reserved for a historical society if it was in existence. And so some states basically said, all right, we better found one, especially if you want to have it in this city in the state and not that city in the state. If we go past 1850, usually within 20 to 40 years of the first historical society being founded in whichever city it is, either the second city or the biggest city, if it doesn't host it, is like, wait a minute, what about us? Because most of the historical societies started out focusing, even though they said they were focusing on a larger basis, most of their actions were much more local. Now, with regards to members and officers, it's a very small group who really were there. First off, they're white. They are not just white, but by and large, they are Protestant, and they are descended from Anglo-American settlers. There are some exceptions, Peter de Ponceau in Pennsylvania being one of the most notable, but by and large, most of the members and certainly most of the active officers are of English descent. So that also shapes the kind of history that they're looking for. They're mostly men. There are a couple of exceptions where women are allowed membership, sometimes a third-class membership, one way or another. Some didn't get around to allowing women membership until 1960s. Massachusetts, I'm looking at you. Women actually were largely involved. Women are donating things. Sometimes their donations are attributed to them, but I have at least one instance in Rhode Island where a woman possessed materials, her brother-in-law got them and gave them to the Rhode Island Historical Society, and the Rhode Island Historical Society put his name down as the donor. Because part of this is we're talking also about a time period where we don't have the internet, we don't have all these social media ways of getting information around. So even if you have something that you think is historical or worth valuable, you have to know that it's worth valuable. You have to know that a historical society exists. You have to know that society might be interested in what you have. This problem is still in existence even to today. And then once you know about that, you can't go on the internet and find out what's the address and just send it to them, and then they open up their box and say, right, now what do we do with it? Or sometimes they say, yeah, this is great, let's get more of it. So you try, if you're lucky, you actually know somebody who is a member or who knows a member and get access to it by that way. Also, the members, particularly the officers of early historical societies, are wealthy to a degree, and they're professionals, which in that time basically means ministers, lawyers, doctors, maybe merchants. But the founder of the American Antiquarian Society, Isaiah Thomas, did not have a college degree, and he was a printer, which was a trade. The Massachusetts Historical Society did not make him a member until he published a 2-volume history of printing in America. And it was too late by that time because he was on the verge of founding the second one, and Massachusetts Historical Society really lost out because he left the American Antiquarian Society 30,000, which went a lot back then. They're also, and this is largely by design, bipartisan, whichever parties there are at the time. They're not the leading politicals. If you find a governor on, he's usually honorary, and he's usually not really that active or really involved. These are the kind of people, actually, for the most part, who don't appear in history sometimes too much. But these are also the people who have made a big impact on what was preserved. Now, one of the things to talk about there is also, what did they do? because once you've got the society, and it takes a fair amount of effort to get a society in it, you need to have more than one person interested in it. Although one of the problems with many of the historical societies was that they only had one or two really key interested parties. And if either of those dies or moves, the society goes into abeyance. That's very, very common. There are many historical societies who basically they would do work for a year or two and then they'd go dormant for 5 or 6 years or more. And then they'd come back alive and do work for a couple of years and then they go dormant again for another decade or two. Even some of the most notable ones these days had periods of dormancy. Somebody in New Hampshire once wrote about the American Antiquarian Society, wrote to Isaiah Thomas, basically saying, is the society dead? And its founder, who was a year up before he died, basically said, no, like Lazarus, it sleepeth. But many of the early historical societies struggled because you really needed to have, and this is actually one of the reasons why some places did not form one until later, you needed to have a core group of historically minded people who lived close enough to each other to get together and do business, who were all interested in volunteering and willing and potentially doing most of the work. And in some cases, historians were spread out too much throughout the country. But historical societies were also basically a status symbol to a certain extent. In fact, at least one territory formed a historical society before it was a state. What exactly they did? Well, they actually managed to put out a book, because that was one of the things that the historical societies did. Their purpose, for the most part, was not necessarily to write history, but to gather and preserve materials for the writing of history. And once you've got things, one of the best ways these days or then to make sure that something survives is to multiply the copies, which back then meant basically printing. So a lot of the historical societies tried to publish something in their early years, or if they couldn't publish something, they would make an arrangement with a local newspaper to publish things for them. If nothing else, just to publish a list of, here are all the gifts we got, so that they're acknowledging the people who gave those things, giving them credit, giving them cause to maybe puff up in front of their friends, and also sort of saying, okay, hey, these people are giving, maybe you want to give us something too. So a lot of them are trying to print in one way or another, but that also reflects that what they're collecting largely, or what they are trying to collect, is materials for the writing of history, which sometimes they can think of as facts and information. In fact, when the Kentucky Historical Society was first founded, the group resolved that their duty was to collect and preserve authentic information and facts connected with the early history of the state. So they're looking for the actual information that people would then be using to write history, not necessarily documents and other things like that. When we get to the circular, things actually get a little bit better for Kentucky, but with the Massachusetts Historical Society, many years earlier, their first circulars, and circulars are basically wish lists, where their society is saying, okay, we need to tell you what kinds of things we're looking for, because if we don't tell you, you may have something and not realize it. But their first lists are very much describing the kinds of information they want. They want information about when this town was founded, who were the leading citizens, when was the church founded, who was the minister, that kind of information that actually you might find in an annal. And most of the earliest volumes of the Massachusetts Historical Society's collections, which a lot of people don't read because they're boring, are people in the various towns of Massachusetts just basically saying, okay, this is what they're asking for, so I'm going to write it down. They aren't necessarily even original materials. Other historical societies did get into that, although most historical societies, let's just say that they were also critiquing each other, and one of them basically said, we're going to try and make our publications less repulsive to the general reader. Part of most of their publications were pretty lousy. I've also looked at a lot of the popular histories at the time. The popular histories, they have images, so they've got all sorts of nice visuals to draw people in. They're arranged chronologically. Most historical societies did not arrange their publications chronologically. they say, it's not necessary. It's going to take too much time. It's not going to take, okay, it would take more time then than it would now. But that's one of the problems. They don't provide indexes because it takes too long. They don't provide chronological tables of contents. They don't really, basically the presumption there is that people are going to read all the way through. And some scholars definitely did read all the way through, but if you look at the table of contents, usually of their publications, they were pretty bland. They would say, okay, like excerpts from so-and-so's diary, or letter from so-and-so to so-and-so, which means you have to know additional information to think, oh, well, maybe some of this is actually going to be interesting. For instance, in one volume, the Massachusetts Historical Society squashed letters from Increase Mather to the then Governor Dudley of Massachusetts, in between some basically recounting of different cities' foundings. They look like they're not going to be much of anything, but if you read them through, Increase Mather is basically accusing the governor of at least 7 different kinds of sins or crimes, including complicity in murder and absence from the church on Sabbath, which was, of course, a really big deal. So they're trying to collect this information. And one of the things that I found really interesting as I was doing this research was because even nowadays, there's so much difference of opinion over what is history. And at that time, they're trying to figure out, what do we need to collect for people to write the history of the United States? And sometimes they're thinking, okay, well, we need this public information, because a lot of the early information that they were trying to collect really was very much the kind of things that everybody at some point or another might know. It's about this public shared life that all of the members had. It's kinds of things that were in the newspapers back then, which were very different from the newspapers right now. They usually did not feature in-depth reporting. They were more likely to have, news of ships' arrival, news of people coming in. They'd reprint news that had appeared in other newspapers. But actually, let's go a little bit more deeper, because I will share my screen, because I do have the Connecticut Historical Society circular up here. So we'll talk not just generally about what historical societies were interested in, but what Kentucky was interested in sharing. So this is the circular, and it's the circular as printed in the American Quarterly, written by Edmund Jarvis. So at that time. And the objects of the Kentucky Historical Society are the collection and preservation of whatever may relate to the antiquities, the natural, civil, literary, ecclesiastical history of this country. This is actually fairly typical because most of the state historical societies were collecting materials for American history, as in the United States, as in general, and their state in particular. There's a lot also of city historical or county historical societies being founded during these times too. They do a similar thing. They basically, we're going to collect the history of the state in general, but our city or county in particular, partially to show just how important we are. And one of the things that I find quite interesting about that is the list of the antiquities, natural, civil, literary, ecclesiastical history. Many of the early ones would just say, okay, we're looking for the natural and civil, or the civil and the literary. And the natural history, actually also in the 1830s, it starts dropping off of a lot of the historical societies, because separate natural history societies are being founded, because this is a time when they're undergoing what is called a specialization of knowledge, which basically means each group starts saying, wait a minute, you're doing something different, go off and place it in some other playground somewhere else. So that's actually pretty broad. And then they're collecting materials for their library or cabinet. Cabinet basically was the museum at the time. It's the term that they use for artifacts and for natural specimens if they have them. And so it would be a cabinet keeper, would be the person who kept that. And they're looking for books, papers, documents, etc., which is pretty broad. And this is actually a fairly good one, because if you look there, the second item on the list, my interest in particular is the preservation of manuscript materials, things that were only in one copy. They're looking for original letters, documents, and papers, which serve to illustrate in any way the deeds, habits, manners, customs, and pursuits, that's a pretty comprehensive list of activities involved. of the pioneers and early settlers in Kentucky. I also really like this line because it's not presumptively male. Now, granted, a lot of people are probably interpreting that as, okay, you're interested in what the men are writing, but you're not actually using a term that is exclusively male. And a lot of them were actually saying like leading men or other kinds of things that were more like that. There is actually, and it was not at all what I would expect, but the Alabama Historical Society had a specific thing about wanting the letters and papers of women as well. I will admit, I was not expecting to find that in Alabama, but hey. And so they're looking for early settlers of Kentucky and the other Western states. They're being it more broadly right now, probably also sort of, it's also a bit of a land grab in terms of historical terms, because if you can get the documents of other places, you can start to say, okay, well, here's how Kentucky is better, and here's what Kentucky did that you guys didn't. It potentially gives influence. It's why history is still such a big battlefield. Many of the other listings here are much more about existing printed works, things for their library, which actually are a lot of what they got based on looking at their early donations. They got a lot of printed materials, not a lot of stuff actually about Kentucky, a lot of things about Massachusetts for some reason. But some of the other things to look here, they're looking for statistical tables, topographical descriptions. These are very common because they're trying to gather all sorts of information. But still, they have that nice broad thing of anything that illustrates in any way the pioneers and early settlers of Kentucky, which means also they're placing the historical value or connecting the historical value largely to the person's connection to Kentucky or those Western states. That's a shift that actually happens roughly 1820 to 1840s, and which I would argue is one of the crucial shifts towards making primary sources the building block of history, because they're moving the value from being the facts and information to the value being in the document because it has a connection to people with a specific place. By the 1840s, I have one member of the Rhode Island Historical Society who's specifically putting value on something having a name, recognizable name, or a date, although he still organized things. I'm not going to ask you to read over all of this, but especially because these things are sometimes harder to read. But if we go down to number 10, it's talking about facts, anecdotes, etc., illustrative of the history, habits, customs, and rights of the Indians of North America. One of the things Native Americans are the exception to the Historical Society's largely white Protestant Anglo history focus. Every single historical society wants to collect them in one way or another. But the presumption in here is that what they are collecting is filtered through white voices, white hands, white writing, things writing down. And there's other things, and of course, this being the Midwest, they want information about the mounds, because at that time they still consider the mound builders separate from the indigenous tribes that are around them. Also notice what isn't here. There's one, and again, I'm not going to ask you to read over this. This isn't a trick question. I'm going to give you the answer. Slavery. There is nothing here related to slavery. This actually is not unusual. It's so much absent that it has to be, to a certain extent, a deliberate choice. There are a couple of exceptions, but even most of the historical societies who published a lot of things did not publish very much about slavery. And when they did publish things about slavery, it was pre-1776 or pre-1790. Basically, they're doing the history way as far back as they can. This is not just for the free states, it's also for the slave states. I have written roughly in some of the two examples. One was in Pennsylvania, where somebody wrote and then was published in the Pennsylvania Historical Society's memoirs, a tale of slavery in Pennsylvania up to 1776. Around the same time, there is a discourse that was given in for the Georgia Historical Society. And it's where basically they're lamenting about the fact that Georgia was denied slavery for so long, but it also stops in the 1770s. because at that time, basically, they are deliberately trying to not be political and not be controversial. I wouldn't mind going back in time and giving him a talking to, but it's not happening. Peter Duponceau, actually, who was in his 80s, and he was the president of 2 other learned societies in Philadelphia, and he became the president of the Historical Society of Philadelphia. And he was one of the most explicit invocations of why, yes, we should collect information documenting people of African descent and free people of African descent. But he also explicitly said, basically, this is not the time to collect slavery. And this is not the time to collect it, even with the boldness of a historian. And I'm like, that's a real cop-out. I have another instance, though, where one member of a historical society wrote, or one officer of a historical society wrote to another former officer and member of a historical society. They were currently engaged in bringing out materials talking about fireproof, the needs for fireproof buildings for historical societies for their collections. And the active historical society member, who was in New Hampshire at that time, was John Farmer. He was an abolitionist, and he wrote mentioning that and asking for the other Richard Bartlett's opinion. Richard Bartlett at that point was in New York City, and he was very much a racist. He very much did not believe in the equality of the races. And he wrote not 1, but 2 letters back to John Farmer, dated on the same day. One addressed all of the historical matters in Farmer's letter. The other one is a tirade about how the races are not equal, and basically saying, if you talk any more about this, I'm going to cut it off. So most of the people who were involved in the historical society made the decision, I would say, either consciously or unconsciously, that it's better to collect as much as we can and not collect this. I've gone through the collections records, for the donation records, the accession records, however you want to call them, for a large number of historical societies, particularly by the 1840s, where I could compare them. And most of the manuscript items touching on slavery that I found were dated in the 18th century. Even this is in the 1840s even. So they're still thinking of it as much more an earlier phenomenon, and they're avoiding the present issue. A number of the other historical societies do collect abolition documents, but that's largely because they're printed. They're looking specifically, in some cases, to collect everything that's printed. In fact, most of the historical societies will basically say, we want everything that's printed in the state. And so at least one publisher in Connecticut was basically, well, you're not asking all the butchers to give you examples of everything they do, and the bakers to give you examples of everything they do, and the construction people to give you examples of everything they do. So this is an unfair levy on us. Most of the other publishers, though, were happy to give a copy, although they usually had to be reminded, and many of these early historical societies do not have full runs of everything that they have. A couple of other things just with the early historical societies to take in mind too is, in addition to having putting out publications, one of the things they were also looking into is trying to have some kind of building, some kind of safe repository for their materials. A lot of these, they didn't necessarily, they were saving them from places that had not been taking care of them. They weren't necessarily taking care of them the greatest themselves. They would sometimes have a crowded little room. If they were lucky, maybe it was in the State House. That was one of the ways that the states often underwrote the historical societies. Because another thing about the early historical societies is they were poor. They relied largely on their member fees. When the members remembered to send in their fees, and for those of you who work at historical society, I'm sure it will not be surprised to you how many times you have to sometimes say, all right, you're 3 years in arrears, would you please pay up? A couple of historical societies did get larger donations, but that was not until much later. Just to give you an example, and yes, this is Massachusetts oriented, but the Massachusetts Historical Society is around so long that we've got a lot of good ones from there. In the 1820s, there was a man who gave Massachusetts Historical Society $200. that sounds good. This was one of the biggest gifts they had been given in their whole existence. That same year, that same man gave Harvard $25,000. Now, granted, a good chunk of that was supposed to go to the library, but still, that tells you just how much some of those comparative values were. And a lot of the historical societies, one of the reasons also that they didn't last, so they went into abeyance, was they didn't have enough money to do anything. Or they were, okay, I'm going to say it, they were, I guess I'm not saying it, they were not wise in how they spent their money. New York, I'm looking at you. New York Historical Society actually had to threaten that they were going to sell their library at one point to pay their debts. A good chunk of which were owed to two of their members who had floated them lots of money in the first place, money that they spent on buying books for the library, but also on putting out volumes. It's not like this time where you get the publisher. It's much more like the self-publishing world right now, where basically the person who wants to publish it fronts most of the money. And they had lavish dinners and parades and other things and events to which the women were not allowed until the 1830s. They had lecture series. They had celebrations of themselves. So yeah, New York, they've made some questionable financial choices, but the state eventually came through and helped them out, except for the last debts, which were owed to their founder. And they basically said, okay, if you can't provide a receipt, we're not going to pay you. And they balanced the books that way. I am going to just quickly show you some of the images that I had in the book, which I do have some interesting tales too. So do a quick share of a PowerPoint. So in these behind the scenes, you can sort of see them. Their shoes, they do not appear in the book, but they do appear in the book, but they appear in the other way. They're shoes that were made from fabric that was carried in the Revolution as a flag, probably a French flag, because if you look, you can see a little bit of a Fleur De Lis in there. So this is the Constitution or Charter of the Massachusetts Historical Society, the nice handwriting copy, not the original scribbled copy. And a lot of the words there you'll see are very similar to various other ones. I did a presentation for a small city historical society in Massachusetts that had been founded about 100 years later. And they're like, actually, that looks a lot like ours, because people cribbed off of each other too. This is an example of one of the topographical descriptions that was written up, where they're basically saying, okay, here's where it is. They're just providing all of the little facts and information that were asked about for this in the Massachusetts Historical Society's early circulars. This is an example not of a Massachusetts or any of the other historical society publications. This is a public history publication. You see, it's got visual appeal. It's got all, this is actually from John Warner Barber, who went around various parts of New England, taking down whatever stories people wanted to tell him and drawing up pictures. And the books have a lot of images in them. This is just one page that has 3 of them. And actually the Massachusetts Historical Society might have been a teensy bit threatened by how they didn't want him to use this, what they consider the same name for his publications as he did for them. One of the things also I did, most historical societies did not have rooms that were open to the public. If you wanted to see what the historical society had in their library or their cabinet, you had to know somebody who knew a member or an officer and could arrange for you to get in there. Usually there was no librarian, there were no open hours. If you were lucky, they actually might have a table. I mean, usually what the historical societies did not actually meet in their rooms. They would meet at the members' houses because it was a lot more comfortable there. The exception being Connecticut. I don't know why. I went to do my research in Connecticut thinking I'd be out of there because they were dormant for most of the time that I was looking at, only to look and say, wait a minute, in the 11 years that you really were active, you were active. And they actually decided to hire a librarian to keep their library open for a good chunk of time, 6 days a week. The librarian who left a diary that they published, the diary, I'm sad to say, is extremely dull because he spends a lot of time complaining about all the visitors coming to see what they have, who are interrupting him doing his busy work of dusting the books, because he's got his own library in there. This is a page from their visitor register, and they have their visitor registers. I started going through them and I was like, wait a minute, how many people visited here? Those of you who are involved in tracking visitors know how hard it is to get information about them, even just the numbers. So we know that the number of people who signed the visitor register probably is a significant undercount of how many people actually visited there. But I can tell you in 1850, because I transcribed every single person's name that I could, if I could read the handwriting. Sometimes I couldn't read the handwriting. They had over 3,000 visitors in that one year. To put this in larger perspective, they're in Hartford. The population of Hartford in 1850, according to the census, which is also an undercount, is 13,000. So basically the equivalent of 1/4 of Hartford's population come to visit their rooms. Now, there are a number of reasons for this, and one of which is they didn't listen to all the other historical societies that were basically saying, no, we don't want artifacts. They were like, actually, Christopher Columbus Baldwin, who was for a while one of the most influential librarians of the American Antiquarian Society, basically wrote, so we can quote it, that he poo-pooed collecting hats and high-heeled shoes. Well, I'll tell you, the Connecticut Historical Society got hats, they got shoes, they got at least 10 pairs of shoes, most of which were women's wedding shoes, and they got visitors, and their visitors were predominantly white, predominantly Protestant, but they weren't predominantly wealthy. There was a sizable number of people who were laborers or craftspeople potentially moving up, so that the historical societies there were a site of upward mobility. In this case, one of the things they got was a shirt worn by a particular hero when he was killed during the Revolution. The shirt is actually an interesting tale because they got it from the daughter-in-law of the man who had been killed. The family women had preserved it. She'd gotten it from her mother-in-law, the wife. They preserved it for a good 50 years before it came to the Connecticut Historical Society, along with the vest. But the librarian of the Connecticut Historical Society decided that it wasn't a fitting thing for women, ladies who visited the Connecticut Historical Society rooms to see, because it was too bloody. So he had it laundered, probably by a woman who was of lower order, and now it's basically practically too fragile to put on display. But the family had presumably washed it, because you don't want to keep around a shirt that's stinking of viscera. He decided that wasn't good enough. These are a pair of shoes. They're a pair of shoes that actually I consider was one of the reasons that the Connecticut Historical Society wound up with such an unusual collection, because they were given to them around the time when they were organizing the celebration of the centennial of the colonial charter. They got it 1 year off, but hey, that was because they didn't organize quite in time. But then they had a masque right before that centennial, and at that masque, a number of people wore items of attire, of historical attire. This is the only piece of historical attire that I can say survives from that masque, but it was in the Historical Society records hands at that time. And because of that, they got other ones, like this particular pair of shoes, which is on the cover of the book. They're wonderful. They're embroidered by 2 different hands, if you look close enough. So, and these were specifically given, among other things, as example of women's work. And one of the things that I did as I went through is, in this particular case, I was able to look at the letter that the woman who donated them wrote and compare that to the entry in the donation records to see how she valued them versus how the Connecticut Historical Society valued them. And she included that basically these were the daughters of Timothy Edwards, the sisters of Jonathan Edwards, Mary and Hannah, and that Mary at least had been educated and was fully as fit to enter college as her brother, and equally smart, but that these exhibited the separate sphere of women's activity at the time. Connecticut Historical Society ignored that. They preserved this because it was connection to the Edwards and to Hannah Edwards, these were her wedding shoes, husband, but also because they showed the skill and the different kinds of labor involved in creating them at the time. And I showed you earlier the Fleur De Lis shoes. In this particular case, the Connecticut Historical Society was concerned that somebody might forget they might forget which pair of shoes actually had, because they had so many of them, actually had come from, when were made from the flag and connected to that story. So he wrote on the bottom of them, presented by Mrs. Horatio Fitch. So they can always connect that particular pair of shoes, which is just as well, because there are other things that they got and societies got, like iron pots. Supposedly they got the iron pot of Miles Standish. I don't believe, we can believe that or not, but they don't know nowadays. They don't know which one it is, because if you've got a number of iron pots, unless you put something on there saying a specific number or something like that, you're not going to know who it came from. And also, just I talked earlier about how the historical societies were interested in collecting the history of Native Americans, but a number of Native American tribes and individuals were also interested in collecting their own history and putting their stamp on it. So this particular one is a letter from one of the chiefs of the Cherokee Nation, where they're basically saying, we're trying to gather all of this historical material about the Cherokee Nation. It's not going to be published. It's going to be put forward before all the aged and wise antiquarians of the Cherokee Nation to make sure that we do preserve this for our own use. So it's a really interesting time period. And that leaves a little bit of time for questions if anybody has, because trust me, I'm just touching the highlights of the book.
Thank you so much. That it's really interesting to me to hear that, to learn that about some of the issues that early historical societies had, and that we still have some of those issues today. I was particularly entertained that I think it was Massachusetts, was a year off in terms of celebrating an anniversary because they didn't plan in time. I was like, oh, that never happens to us. So please, I'm sure some of you do have some questions. Please put those in the chat, or I think we're a fairly small group today. So if anybody wants to just unmute and jump right in, you are welcome to do that as well. We'll keep it. Let's see here. Oh, let's see. Mr. Brammer has a question. Did the sermons collected by the early historical societies include those from abolition ministers?
They may well have. If they did, though, it was probably by accident, because most of the historical societies were particularly interested in collecting centennial sermons. This didn't make as much of this, not Kentucky necessarily, but further to the east, where they had been around for a lot longer. The centennial sermons usually would actually give a kind of history of the local area. So they're basically collecting it that way. There's one guy, Benjamin Trumbull, a historian in Connecticut, who collected all the sermons he could get a hand on, especially election sermons. And he read over them and he wrote to the Massachusetts Historical Society, basically saying, they're not historical. There's nothing of interest anywhere in them. But it's quite possible that if people sent their sermons in. One of the things with that, though, is that if they were printed, they would be more likely to be collected, because for the historical societies to get manuscript materials, usually it was someone other than the author who sent to them. It was children, grandchildren, other people who happened, a baker who found them as he was going through pieces of paper. Only in a couple of instances do I have where somebody has the confidence that their writings are sufficiently historical and worthy of preservation that they give their own writings. And I can count the numbers of instances that I can say are definitively of that on one hand, and I'm not using all my fingers. So if they're collecting the abolition ministers' sermons, it's probably because it's been printed somewhere. And so they're collecting it partially as just getting things that were printed in a particular city or a particular state.
All right. Please feel free to continue putting any questions into the chat there. I was curious. It's interesting that many early historical societies, most of them, you mentioned, did not allow or invite women to be members. And yet, like when I look at historical societies today, there's a lot of women driving the work. And actually, I think the majority of museum staff members right now are women. When do you see that start to change? When do women start to become more of a driving force in historical societies?
I would say probably particularly around the 1870s. I mean, that's the other big burst in the number of societies that in existence. Also, over the second half of the 19th century, historical societies got a lot more of a reputation for collecting, just accepting basically anything that came in. So they would, and they actually had to do some deaccessioning in the 20th century to deal with that. Part of that was because just, sometimes they were just so happy to get things in the first place. But that also part of that was it was very much a locating value in artifacts. Also, over the 20th century, there was increasing, because yes, I would say women are a lot of the force, but if you look at the people who are paid the best, men are probably at least still half of that. And even as as late or recent as the 1970s, they would sometimes go through and select things, because that's one of the things that people have not necessarily always recognized, is the extent to which historical societies often, and their officers often did a selective thing. If they're not letting everything in, they have to decide what to let in or what not. And a connection of my family had 4 generations of family who had lived in Newport, Rhode Island. And so they sent their papers to the Newport Historical Society. And a while later, they got back all the papers that the Newport Historical Society had decided not to keep. And somebody went through them and realized that they were all the papers of the women in the families. And those papers ended up in the Schlesinger Library. And there is actually a joke among the librarians at the Schlesinger that another thing they could be called is the ladies' auxiliary of the Massachusetts Historical Society, because there are so many instances where the Massachusetts Historical Society has the men's papers and the Schlesinger has the women's papers in the family. Whether that's because they were offered at the same time or they were offered separately, or whatever, but there's definitely selective factors involved in determining what enters in, and also then how it's preserved, because some of the measures that the early historical societies took to preserve them, people are now undoing, such as binding them, not just in the order that they were received sometimes to some extent, or they also disbound things that were like, okay, really, why did you have to disbound it? But
there in the 1870s, as women become more involved, do you feel like that is that connected to like the memorialization efforts in the post-Civil War era? I don't know. I know that women kind of drove that effort as well. I don't know if they're connected.
Women also were particularly active in the historical preservation movement, which, although it's dated largely to preserving Mount Vernon, there are bits of it earlier, but the early historical societies satisfied themselves sometimes with getting a window sash or something like that. But that was definitely women's involvement, also increasing number of women who are working outside the home. And this is something that was acceptable. The feminization of certain professions, certainly over the eventual feminization of the library possession, for which I'm an example.
Yeah, KHS, you mentioned how many of the early historical societies would kind of go dormant for several years when a member or two who was really doing things passed away. And that happened to KHS several times in the early years. And then I think our first sort of, not real director, I guess, but it was a lady named Jenny Chin Morton in the 1890s who she was a widow, and I don't think she was paid at first. She just did it because that was what she wanted to do, who really kind of got KHS going, if you will. She was quite an institution builder, and it started the it's now a scholarly publication. I'm not really sure you could call the Register of the early days super scholarly, but all right, let's see. Oh, Deborah had a question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
It was scholarly for that time. Because it was publishing the other things there, so
lots of poetry actually, and she was a big Lost Cause supporter, so there's some of that too.
Yeah, and that also reflected the fact that a lot of women had been doing preservative work beforehand, because very often when papers were preserved, that could end up in the Historical Society, they were the women's papers. They were the women, not necessarily women's papers, but the papers that the women in the family had preserved. There's a reason why we often have the men's half of correspondences, because the women preserve the men's half of the correspondence. There's actually an unusual instance where I found the donation records listed a particular donation society, Historical Society had gotten the women's half of the correspondence that the man had kept. A year later, the family asked for it back, and they gave it too. But I do see there is that another question: how aware were various historical societies of their own history, and was I able to dig up information that they were not aware of? Most of them were aware to some extent. I mean, this was possible thanks to the large number of historical societies that let me have access to their resources. Also, though, even at the time, many of them were somewhat aware, because by the 1830s, 1840s, some of them were publishing their proceedings too. New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, in various forms. They were starting to publish those. That said, their idea of how to preserve their own records varied widely. Some of them not very well. And actually, when I went to the New Hampshire Historical Society, they basically told me, okay, if you want to know about our earlier years, you'll find much more information in the collection of John Farmer, who basically was it for many of those years, versus actually in the Historical Society's collections, which means that all of those things had left, and then they'd had to actually buy them to get them in there. But one of the things also that I found interesting is that most of the officers of the Early Historical Society, the only way we know who they are is because they were, if possible, they might have been memorialized in the Early Historical Society publications. Their papers aren't part of the historical societies unless they were acquired much later. For instance, Jeremy Belknap, who was the founding member of the Massachusetts Historical Society. The Massachusetts Historical Society didn't get his papers until he died in the 1790s. Massachusetts Historical Society didn't get his papers until the 1850s. And at that point, they were valuing them more for the things he had collected. And only as somebody started going through them, they were saying, oh, wait a minute, he's also got all this stuff. Because it's also about when do things become history? And quite frankly, a lot of things are history if they date before you were born. So as we start having young people who had been born later in control of the Historical Society, the shifting date of when they're really saying, okay, well, you want anything before this time, especially because if it's before I was born, it's history.
Interesting. All right. So thank you, Mr. Trevitt. He said most interesting and informative talk. All right. If there are any more questions, please do feel free to go ahead and put those in the chat. But thank you so much. You've inspired me. I think I am curious now about when some of our collections came in, and because we do have some objects and papers related to some of the early founders, but I'm curious when they came in. So all right, well, guys, please don't forget to join us next month for First Friday with Ben Montgomery, A Shot in the Moonlight. I will be on for a few minutes afterwards if anybody has any questions or comments, but thank you so much. We will go ahead and wrap things up. Y'all have a great afternoon.
Thank you.